The Draft Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme, Amendment Order 326.
I call the Minister to move the motion.
Thank you, Sir Desmond. I beg to move that the committees considered the Draft Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Order 2026, and I'm grateful to the Chair and the committee for their consideration of this statement. The order was laid before Parliament on the 16th of December 2025. The UK Emissions Trading Scheme, the UK ETS, was established under the Climate Change Act 2008 by the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Order 2020, the 2020 order, as a UK-wide greenhouse gas emissions trading scheme contributing to the UK's emissions reduction targets and net zero goal. The scheme is run by the UK ETS Authority, a joint body comprising the UK Government and the devolved governments. Our aim is to be predictable and responsible guardians of the scheme and its markets. Under the UK ETS, operators are required to monitor, report on and surrender allowances in respect of their greenhouse gas emissions. While most allowances are purchased at regularly held auctions, operators in certain sectors at risk of carbon leakage are given a number of allowances for free, referred to as the free allocation. Free allocations reduce exposure to the carbon price for these sectors at risk of carbon leakage and reduce the risk that decarbonisation efforts could be undermined by production and the associated emissions moving to other countries. Under the UK ETS, an operator is the person or company that has control over an installation. Installations are stationary units at which regulated activities take place. Sub-installations represent operations carried out at an installation in respect of which operators that receive free allocation are required to report activity levels for the purpose of the UK ETS. We have brought forward this statutory instrument to enable important changes and improvements to the scheme. The first change that this instrument makes is to enable operators of installations to be able to notify their regulator that they wish to have their activity data for the 2020 scheme year or 2020 and 2021 scheme years excluded from the calculation of their historical activity level for the 2027 to 2030 free allocation period. This is in recognition of the fact that production levels may have been impacted during the COVID-19 pandemic. These operators will be able to notify their regulator during the second stage of the 2027 to 2030 free allocation period, which runs from the 1st of April 2026 to the 30th of June 2026, that they wish to have their activity data for 2020 or 2020 and 2021 excluded. Legal change is needed to the free allocation regulation because existing legislation would require regulators to calculate historical activity levels using activity data from all 5 years of the baseline period, 2019 to 2023. If amendments are not made, there will be no legal basis for regulators to exclude 2020 or 2020 and 2021 data from the historical activity level calculation for any applicant. Using activity data for these years could result in historical activity levels that do not reflect normal activity, meaning that operators would receive fewer free allocations than to which they would otherwise be entitled. The second change that the instrument makes is to gradually phase out free allocation for sectors covered by the UK Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the UK CBAM, starting over the 2027 to 2030 allocation period. This phase-out will be implemented through applying a UK CBAM reduction factor to the calculation of free allocation and will apply at the sub-installation level. To do this, operators will be required to report which of their sub-installations serve the production of goods within the UK CBAM. This will enable regulators to apply the UK CBAM reduction factor to the relevant sub-installations. Legal change is needed, as currently operators only classify their sub-installations by a specific benchmark and the corresponding carbon leakage status of that sub-installation. This instrument requires operators to also classify each sub-installation as relevant for UK CBAM or not relevant for UK CBAM. Benchmarks are the efficiency standards used to calculate each installation's free allocation entitlement. Installations closer to their benchmark have a higher proportion of emissions covered by free allocation, rewarding more efficient installations and incentivising decarbonisation. The third change that the instrument makes is to use current benchmarks for the purpose of calculating free allocation for stationary installations for the 2027 scheme year. This instrument also provides for the ability to update the benchmark values used to calculate free allocation for the years 2028, 2029 and 2030 of the 2027 to 2030 allocation period. Maintaining current benchmarks for the 2027 year will allow time for industrial participants to adjust to the changes. Legal change is needed to the free allocation regulation because under existing legislation there is no provision to update benchmarks during an allocation period. The in-principle intent is to use the updated EU ETS Phase 4 benchmarks in the 2028, 2029 and 2030 scheme years. This will be decided once the EU benchmark values are available and subject to assessment of the impact. Installations that permanently cease to operate are required to report on their activity in the final year of operation so that free allocation can be recalculated to reflect the cessation of activity. This amendment clarifies that the requirement on operators to report on the activity levels of a sub-installation, whether that is due to permanent cessation, as is currently provided for, or due to the surrender or revocation of the operator's permit. This amendment clarifies that operators must report on the activity levels in instances of permanent cessation or due to the surrender or revocation of the operator's permit. The intended changes follow comprehensive engagement and consultation with stakeholders. The UK and devolved governments carried out consultations that covered the provisions included in this statutory instrument. The free allocation review consultation ran from the 18th of December 2023 to the 11th of March 2024, seeking views on proposals to alter the free allocation methodology for the UK ETS stationary sectors to better target those most at risk of carbon leakage and ensure that free allocations are fairly distributed. The free allocation review carbon leakage consultation ran between the 16th of December 2024 and the 10th of March 2025. It sought views on a draft UK-focused carbon leakage list compiled by applying UK data to the existing carbon leakage list, as well as the trajectory for phasing out free allocations for sectors that will be covered by the UK Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. The relevant responses to these consultations were summarised in the authority response. The changes in the draft order will deliver on commitments made by the UK ETS Authority, improve the fairness of the scheme and increase certainty for both regulators and operators. These changes will ensure that free allocation continues to provide meaningful support to UK industry while maintaining the incentive to decarbonise and rewarding efficient installations. The amendments to the UK ETS will support its role as a key pillar of the UK's climate policy. They demonstrate that we will take action to improve the scheme where necessary. I commend the order to the committee.
The question is that the committee has considered the draft Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Order 2026. I call Claire Coutinho, Shadow Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Swain, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. So I'm sure members will have been hanging on every word of the Minister there, but they may not have made it through the dense forest of governmentitis. So let me be very clear. The measures in this legislation, which will be imposed from 2027, will reduce the supply of free allowances, thereby increasing the carbon tax in this country. This is explicitly stated in the government's own impact assessment. Free allowances have been the mechanism which we use to protect businesses like cement and steel from being undercut by cheaper imported products from countries that don't charge carbon taxes. It's meant that those businesses have not faced the higher costs from the tax and therefore neither have consumers. Now, because of the CBAM, the protection is being moved to a tariff placed on imports at the border, which means the free allowances in the domestic UK market are being phased out. And members should be very clear. What this means is that the carbon tax will now start to be charged on the production of goods produced for the British market that otherwise had been protected by free allowances, and British consumers will face higher prices as a result. So what does this mean in practice? The carbon tax is paid by industrial businesses like gas power stations, oil refineries and food manufacturers. The government makes them pay a tax for every tonne of carbon they release during their production. Naturally, those taxes are passed straight through to consumers as higher prices. So if the government increases the carbon tax, they increase the price of basic goods like electricity, petrol and sugar. And the government know this because in the impact assessment for this legislation, they admit exactly that. Higher carbon taxes will be passed through to consumers as higher prices. Impact assessment 18.8 for the members checking. Higher energy prices, higher food prices, higher petrol prices. And the government insists that they need to do this because they have decided to link the UK carbon tax scheme to the EU's. That was their decision. That was a political choice. And that alone has doubled our carbon tax since the start of last year. We're not talking about a slight increase. We're talking about a tax which has more than doubled in less than a year because of choices made by this Labour government. Families across this country will have less money in their pockets, not because of an act of God or because of events outside of the government's control, but because of an active policy choice made by Labour ministers. Doubling the carbon tax has increased electricity bills alone by £4 billion. In fact, the carbon tax imposed by the government now accounts for over £100 per year. I'll just make some progress and I will. In fact, the carbon tax imposed by the government now accounts for over £100 per year, or over 12% of the average electricity bill. The increase is costing the wider British economy an extra £5 billion a year, and the legislation that Labour members will vote for today will pile more costs onto consumers. The Prime Minister recently said his priority is the cost of living, but across his government, hundreds of decisions, like this piece of legislation today, are raining down more regulations and higher taxes, which are pushing costs up. Policies that will push rents up, that have driven food prices up, that are landing on people's energy bills. And the impact assessment accepts that this policy today will push up energy bills. But extraordinarily, for a government that says its priority is the cost of living, it does not give a figure for how much. And that is why the Prime Minister will fail. It is why this Labour government is failing. There is no appetite or accountability in his government for even understanding what these policies will mean for the consumer, let alone trying to act in the consumer's interest. And if I'm wrong, and the member might be able to give an answer, if the party opposite has an assessment for what this will do to energy bills, perhaps he can give us the numbers. I suspect he won't be able to, but I'd happily let him try.
Al-Hassan.
I'd like to thank the Right Honourable Member for giving way. And I reference your call to the impact assessment in 18.8.
That would be me.
Chair, I appreciate and thank you. I pleasure serving with your chairship. On the impact assessment, it says that the impact assessment's 18.8 section should be treated with caution because they are at the upper end of estimates. Does that mean that that same treated with caution should apply to everything that the honourable member opposite has said?
So I think what the honourable gentleman is saying is that, yes, the impact assessment does make clear that the consumers will face higher costs. The question that I'm asking and that I put to him is, what will that mean for people's energy bills? I would suspect that is something that his constituents would be concerned with. The fact that he does not have an answer is something that he should ask of his government and what this will mean for people's energy bills. I will actually make some progress, unless he has an answer on energy bills.
I can answer quite quickly. So I'd like to thank the Right Honourable Member for giving way. And with it, an 18.8, the words can is written there, but it doesn't say will. And so I think the assumption from the Honourable Member opposite that these figures, which are quite clearly written in this, only may lead to price increases, should surely be one for the Minister to answer in a minute.
I think it's absolutely extraordinary that the member doesn't accept that a higher price of carbon imposed on the production of goods in this country will not raise costs. We have seen, in fact, from the prices of people's energy bills, that the cost of the carbon tax on people's electricity bills now accounts for, I think it's worth him listening to, rather than pointing to the document, it's worth him listening to what I say. The carbon tax now accounts for £100 of someone's electricity bills. That's 12% of someone's electricity bills. That's clearly a cost that has been passed through. And if the Labour Party cannot understand that taxes on businesses get passed on to consumers, I'm afraid that I cannot help them in this debate. Because make no mistake, this is a massive burden on consumers and businesses. So why is the government doing this? Who benefits? Well, the Treasury will see an extra £1.8 billion in tax revenue because they've doubled the carbon tax. And through this legislation, by reducing free allowances, they will rake in even more from ordinary families who are already struggling. And that is in fact the entire point. The aim of the carbon tax is to gradually increase costs for British industry until they have no choice but to spend hundreds of millions of pounds they don't have at the moment to decarbonise for their production or shut down and move abroad. The fact that companies are choosing to do the latter means that there will be no reduction in global emissions because those businesses are just moving elsewhere. there will be fewer jobs in Britain and more businesses in countries which have more polluting regimes, so more carbon in the atmosphere overall. The impact assessment that the ministers published on page 68 says that the carbon tax would be £25 lower by 2030 if they did not make the changes we are discussing today. And as the government has admitted, higher carbon taxes feed through to consumers in terms of higher energy bills and higher costs. So the minister is asking us to approve legislation today that by his own assessment will hurt industry, will fuel inflation and make people poorer. And when defending alignment, ministers point to a Frontier Economics report which says that the alignment will save £800 million. But that £800 million is supposedly saved over 5 years and completely ignores the cost that higher carbon prices impose on the wider economy. So they're imposing, just to be clear, a £5 billion tax rise on the economy every year in the hope of saving just £160 million a year. That is incoherent, to say the least. When I asked the department how increasing the carbon tax affects consumers and businesses, their response was that they couldn't comment on current prices and price movements because they don't dictate the market. But that is total nonsense. They can and should forecast what this will mean for prices and how much our constituents will pay in extra costs on their bills. All I am asking for is that ministers are open about these costs, admit that they are imposing them on businesses and the public, make the argument as to why they are justified to do so, and then let the public decide. I do not think that is too much to ask. So I ask the Minister these questions. What is his assessment of how many jobs will be lost because of higher carbon taxes? How many more domestic industries will be replaced by foreign imports, as we're already seeing in gas, steel, chemicals and refineries? Does he accept that reducing free allowances through this legislation will increase energy bills? And his own impact assessment says that reducing free allowances will increase carbon prices by £25 per tonne. So will he publish an assessment of what that increased cost will add to people's household bills? And finally, Mr. Swain, I will end on this. The world is getting more dangerous. Our raw industrial power is hard power. The government should not be making our industry even less competitive with soaring carbon taxes, making us more reliant on foreign imports, just as the world is becoming less safe. This is the wrong measure for the wrong time, and for those reasons we'll be opposing this legislation today.
Sadiq Al-Hassan.
Thank you, Chair. This order is crucial in ensuring businesses aren't penalised for the extraordinary circumstances of the pandemic. By correcting historical activity levels to account for reduced activity during COVID-19 lockdowns, we ensure that fair treatment for operators whose operations were disrupted through no fault of their own. It updates our efficiency benchmarks to reflect current industry performance and further drive decarbonisation. As an essential goal, we must continue to pursue to protect our planet for future generations. And it enables our carbon border adjustment mechanism to work effectively by phasing out free allocation where appropriate, ensuring a level playing field between domestic producers and imports. This is sensible housekeeping that supports both our climate ambitions and our industrial base at a time when it's urgently needed.
Does it support the ambition of reducing bills?
I'd like to thank you for that intervention. And I think, actually, when you fix some of the problems around climate change, like investing in energy infrastructure, making sure that we take the true cost of business, then eventually that will bring down bills. Because at the moment, what the party opposite seems to be saying is they don't want to account for the cost of climate change, which is maddening considering their previous position. Thank you, Chair.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Chair. This is quite extraordinary. Quite extraordinary. We have debates in the House of Commons every week where everybody bemoans the price of electricity. And yet we have here an order that will increase bills on businesses significantly. When you reduce the annual allowance for those industries, you're increasing the bills. We have debates about businesses shutting down, having to be propped up by the government in order to protect communities and protect jobs. And why are they shutting down? Because of the energy cost. All of them, without exception. And this order and this emissions trading scheme is driving up bills, and it is the sole reason why industries are leaving the country and they are going overseas. I'm delighted to give way to the gentleman who I do hope will clarify whether he's spoken to any of these industries and to the communities who are having their jobs slaughtered because of this lunacy.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for giving way. And I'm sure the Honourable Member, as somebody with a great degree of business experience, understands the global trading environment we sit in and the energy shocks that come from events like perhaps Russia and Ukraine. And I would just like to, thank him as well for his note on talking with businesses in my constituency. I spend a lot of time talking with businesses in my constituency. I don't know if your party does the same. Would you like to clarify that?
I'm most grateful. The reason that so many industrial businesses are shutting down, whether it's at Moss Moran, whether it's at Grangemouth, whether it's at Immingham, and more besides, whether it's the automotive sector, is because of the high cost of electricity and this emission trading scheme and the linkage of it to the EU emission trading scheme has driven up the carbon taxes, which of course has therefore driven up bills, driven up costs, and therefore industries are less competitive, and as was previously said, they have to pass that cost from the business onto the consumer. And therefore what this is doing is making our industry and our businesses less competitive, and the tragedy of that is that therefore we're destroying growth, we're destroying jobs, and all we are doing is sending these industries overseas, and then the CO2 is produced over there, we've lost the jobs, we've lost the money, and we've become poorer. And for that, I will be voting against this order.
Thank you very much, Desmond. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship in this committee today. And I just want to make a couple of very quick remarks, partly in relation to the ceramics industry, which is a one-trick pony of mine for these events. But the sector is very grateful that it's not included in CBAM for some of the reasons that have already been discussed today. The current arrangements that we have in the sector are quite challenging. The Minister, I know, is acutely aware of this and has been a steadfast ally in some of the work that we're trying to do to seek some long-term support for a sector that is very difficult to decarbonise, is incredibly difficult to improve on technology because of the way in which it is set up, but is also producing things that are integral to this government's missions, whether that be house bricks for a house building programme or advanced ceramics to support our defence industry, to support our growing exports, our pharmaceuticals, or our factories that we need, because you can't make steel in this country without ceramics. There are a couple of questions I'd like to put to the Minister. One is around the allocation of free allowances. I recognise entirely that CBAM will reduce the free allowance allocations that are put to those sectors that are going to be part of CBAM. Would it be possible to consider a reallocation of those free allowances to those sectors that aren't in CBAM and don't necessarily want to be, but for where the decarbonisation programme is most difficult, so namely the ceramic sector, because we are still at huge risk of carbon leakage. It is an unfair market that we work in at the moment, not least because of the way in which non-market economy status countries import into this country, and the Trade Remedies Authority that was set up by the previous government doesn't necessarily have the teeth to levy the import tariffs necessary to create a level playing field for consumers. The other part that I wonder if the Minister is able to touch on is where he sees the cap going in future years. I'm aware that the consultation that was started, I believe, by the Honourable Lady when she was the Secretary of State in the last government, was to look at how you could incentivise decarbonisation through raising the taxation on the most polluting sectors. The Minister will be aware the ceramic sector is desperately trying to do all it can to reduce the output that it has through greenhouse gases, but when you've got to run a kiln at several hundred degrees for many hours to do the bisque and the glaze fire, and when you need to run refractories for 12 to 14 hours at 1500 degrees, that is a really difficult thing to do. Electrification isn't something that's available to many of them at the moment because the capital to invest in those sorts of kilns is simply not available, because the profit margins on their products don't allow for it. Hydrogen is not a technology that is yet proven to be viable because of the chemistry that necessarily takes place inside a kiln. So we are wedded to gas for the foreseeable future, and therefore wedded to being one of the country's last remaining polluting industries. What the sector fears is that as we move at pace to meet some of those decarbonisation agendas and reducing the overall cap in the emission trading scheme, that then means the free allowances also have to come down. That will push the ceramic sector into have to buying many, many more free allowances, which is a cost that then is simply passed on to consumers, or in some cases will mean, no, I won't, I'm afraid, will not then allow the will not then allow the sector to be able to put that money into the investment that is needed to bring down the outputs that those factories make through new technology. So if the Minister is able, when he sums up, to address those 2 points, I know that the sector that I think is meeting with me later on today will be glad to hear from him.
Thank you, Sir Desmond. I want to make some general points and then I want to ask a Northern Ireland specific question of the Minister, if I might. I really am amazed that in a debate where the starting point is that free allowances are going to be removed, that there's any serious dispute of the contention that an inevitable consequence of that is a rise in costs. One inevitably follows the other. If you take away something that is free to business and impose charge, then inevitably there is going to be something to pass on, which will be passed on to consumers. Indeed, in 18.8 that the Honourable Member referred to, trying to make something out of the fact that the word can is used in the context of price increases, he didn't read on, because then it says, enabling substantial price pass-through. Substantial price pass-through. Pass-through to whom? To the consumers. So it is abundantly clear that what this government is doing in liquidating the free allowances is saying, though it's sought to be hidden in the verbosity, the impenetrable wording of this document, what they're saying is that de facto the costs are going to be passed to the consumer. And we all know, as has already been said in this debate, that means businesses not able to continue in many cases, or in some cases, maybe moving abroad, all the consequences that could flow from that. So I think it is something that is retrograde, not progressive in any sense. And then we have the point that within these regulations, it seems to me, and the Minister will correct me if I'm wrong, that the ultimate destination is to attach ourselves to the EU benchmark without knowing what the EU benchmark will be, without ever being able to have an influence on what it should be. So we're really signing a blank check in pursuit of this realignment with the EU, whereby it's the EU benchmark which will in future dictate what the levels are. That seems to me to be the height of madness. I come now to the Northern Ireland Pacific question. I assume I am right in thinking that these emission tradings apply generally and therefore obviously include electricity. If that is right, considering that Northern Ireland, sadly, is in a different emission trading scheme in regard to electricity, how then will these regulations apply, if at all, to electricity in Northern Ireland? If the Minister could please explain that. And what are the consequences? What are the consequences if the regulation doesn't apply, or if it does apply, to a region whose electricity production is under a different ET scheme? So I think there is a practical question there. I'd like to get a very clear answer from the Minister, because frankly, there's nothing very clear about this 104 pages of impenetrable prose which goes with this attempt to push this upon the British people.
Thank you very much, Sir Desmond. And I'd like to start by thanking everyone for their contributions to the debate as well, which was considerably more fulsome and energised than is usual for a 4:30 committee. But I am incredibly grateful, because members on both sides of the House raised a number of points and give me the opportunity to clarify some details around the workings of the scheme. And when the Shadow Secretary of State said that it was a very dense report with a lot of government itis, I know that she really understands the details of this very well. because, of course, as she's the former Secretary of State. But I do appreciate it is a very technical area, and I think it's beholden on all of us to try and explain as clearly as possible what these regulations mean. So maybe I'll start by addressing some of the specific points in the regulations and then talk a bit more generally about some of the points that people have raised. So in terms of the specific points in the regulations, I appreciate the concerns on both sides of the House about the impact on industry and the risk when we're decarbonising industry, the risk to deindustrialisation. And I know that that's a concern that's sincerely felt by everybody who is in this room, even if we might differ at times on what we think the best approach is. And that's why we've been so careful to consult with industry on these measures, as I outlined in my sort of very long catalogue of dates that I read out when I was speaking at the start of the debate. And we've consulted very carefully with industry and made sure that we've listened to what industry has said. And some of the issues here run quite broadly around industrial competitiveness. And possibly two of the main things to recognise is it's important through all of this decarbonisation process that industry manages to maintain access to its key markets. And clearly one of the key markets is the EU. And that's where we come to the discussion about linking the EU ETS and the UK carbon border adjustment mechanism with the EU as well to enable our UK industries to continue to trade there. And negotiations with the EU started in November, but I want to be clear that those negotiations will only conclude in this way if it's in the UK interest to do that. And we'll continue to consult with UK industry on that matter too. And also my honourable friend, the member for Stoke on Trent Central, there were specific requests from the ceramics industry as well. They made 3 specific requests of us in this consultation, and we managed to adopt those requests too around ceramics being on the carbon leakage list, no tiering of free allocations, and also greater engagement with the ceramic sector, which is why we set up the UK ETS working group. And though he asked me specifically if we could reallocate free allocations from other sectors to ceramics, that's not possible within the current rules. But that doesn't mean that I'm not aware of the issues surrounding the ceramic sector, and we can use that UK ETS group to look at the ETS issues, but we should look also more broadly at the concerns of the ceramic sector. And I look forward to starting that conversation over dinner with him and the rest of the ceramics industry later this evening, and we will do that. On the question of power and the impact of this on energy bills, I think the important point to mention here is that, of course, the ETS applies to power that's produced from fossil fuels, not from renewable energy. And it's this government's policy to pursue our clean power mission by 2030, which is investing in the cheapest forms of power available, in onshore wind, in offshore wind, and in solar power, and of course in nuclear energy too. And the purpose of the ETS is to incentivise that. So the carbon price incentivises investment. It provides that level of incentive in power and in industry to invest in new green technologies. And a member for North Antrim, I think... Yes, I will, absolutely.
So, originally, the choice was between coal and gas, but there is no coal in the system anymore. So there is only gas, and even in his own clean power plans, gas is the dispatchable power in the system. There is no other choice. There is nothing else which is going to keep the lights on when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And even in his plans, gas will set the price 50% of the time. So what he is doing is needlessly imposing a tax that inflates that that price of gas to the consumer when there is no other choice available. So would he go away and at least come up with a forecast for what this will mean for energy bills and consumers in this country, considering that they do not have another choice, even in his own plans, apart from to use gas power?
Minister?
Thank you, Chair. So I think what the Shadow Secretary of State has outlined there is exactly the success of this policy. It's driven coal out of the system in favour of more cheaper power, and that's exactly the point of the ETS, and it is also in terms of the industrial investment too. And of course, as we said, the renewable energy, so why we're pursuing our clean power mission is for energy security and to lower energy bills, as well, of course, to ensure that we have green energy too. Yes.
Could the Minister explain why his impact assessment says opposite things on the same page? So it says, in respect of the £92 million direct net cost to business, that on the one hand, quote, our working assumption is that all costs are incurred to business with no indirect impact to households. And then in the very next paragraph says, we estimate that cost pass-through for most sectors could feasibly be at 80 to 90%. Both of those things can't be true, can they?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Well, what can be true is that there are both costs and savings for industry. If we're talking about industry specifically here, particularly the savings associated with industry, particularly the savings for industry associated with being members of the UK Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which will come into force in 12 months' time and enable, if we link the UK and the EU ETS, enable UK industry to trade freely within the EU as they have done in the past. And just turning to the question to the member, no, I've dealt with that. No, I've dealt with that. Just turning to the question from the member for North Antrim. So he asked me specifically about the issue in Northern Ireland, of course, Northern Ireland being in a separate electricity zone. So electricity generators in Northern Ireland haven't historically received a free allocation. And in future, the free allocation rules on electricity generation will apply in the same way for the UK and EU operators, assuming that there is that linkage. So also just turning as well back to this point, the point that that was covered by the Secretary of State and also by others, this point about industry. Clearly the drive here is to incentivise investment in industry, and that's precisely what this policy does, and that's precisely the mechanism of the carbon price. And it is, I think, a fallacy to assume that that investment in industry will result in perhaps less efficient or more expensive industrial products. It's certainly not the case for the steel industry, where investing in green technology also results in lower costs of production as well. But it is the government's policy framework that, of course, creates the opportunity for industrial companies to have a clear framework for investment too. Yeah, certainly.
Claire Coutinho.
I appreciate his graciousness in understanding our concern for industry. His priority is decarbonisation, but I'm sure the Minister will understand the very real risk that what is happening to businesses and industry is that it is not the UK decarbonising by those industries remaining here and cutting their emissions. What is happening is those industries are going abroad. They're often going abroad to countries which have more polluting regimes than the UK, which has some of the cleanest electricity anywhere in the world. They're going abroad to places which are still powered by coal, for example. So what will happen is, rather than anybody reducing carbon emissions across the world, we are actually increasing emissions by moving our businesses from the UK to countries abroad with more polluting regimes. So fewer jobs in Britain for more carbon in the atmosphere. What is the government's plan to monitor whether this is happening, to change course if this is happening? Because surely the Minister would agree that is not decarbonising well. That is in fact not decarbonising the planet at all.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. So the Shadow Minister and I do share exactly the same concerns. We are clearly both concerned about the same thing, and I know that this is shared across the House. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the deindustrialisation and decarbonisation, they don't necessarily need to be in competition. And sadly, what we did see under the previous government was a 30% reduction in our cement production in the UK, nearly a 50% reduction in automotive production, a 30% reduction in chemicals production. And that's why, alongside the ETS policy, we published our industrial strategy. It's why I brought forward the British Industrial Competitiveness Scheme to reduce energy costs for 7,000 manufacturing businesses, as well as the increase of the supercharger as well for energy-intensive industries up to 90%, because clearly we recognise that energy costs have been too high in the UK for industrial businesses as well as consumers. That's primarily a result of the policy of the previous government to leave us at the mercy of petrostates and fossil fuel dictators on the roller coaster of fossil fuel prices. Whereas for us, she says my priority is decarbonisation. Well, I happen to be in a place where there's a very happy coincidence between energy security, decarbonisation, and the lowest cost of energy as well. That's recognised by industry, and that's why it's very much government's policy. And I feel like I've detained the committee members too long, so she'll excuse me. So if she'll excuse me, I think it might be a good idea just to draw the debate to a close, because I do feel we've had a good debate, but at the same time, I have detained the committee for quite a long time. So on the specific points of this particular statutory instrument, As I say, it will give some certainty to the industry around benchmarks and around free allocations. The free allocations reduction is specifically for those sectors that are part of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, so other sectors won't be affected. It does need to be in place for applicants to apply for their free allocations for the period to April 2026. And the statutory instrument will be implement the proposed changes and the improvements to the scheme. These changes have the support of the four governments of the UK, and this consensus in advancing carbon pricing policy adds to the strength of the UK ETS. Therefore, I commend this draft order to the committee.
The question is that this committee has considered the draft Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Order 2026. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no.
Oh, no, sorry. Wasn't you? No, sorry.
Division.
Sorry.
Are the whips content?
Yeah.
Lock the doors.
Thought you were going to let it pass.
Sadiq Al-Hassan.
Aye.
Steve Barclay.
No.
Claire Coutinho.
No.
Harriet Cross.
No.
Anna Dixon. Mary Glindon. Amanda Hack. Paulette Hamilton. Chris McDonald.
Aye.
Gregor Poynton.
Aye.
Mr Conor Rand.
Aye.
Gareth Snell. Alison Taylor. Bradley Thomas.
No.
Yuan Yang.
The ayes were 11 and the noes 4, so the ayes have it. Unlock.